These verses are described as the comfort verses of Jeremiah because they are thought to have been written after the return of the Babylonian exiled people to what remains of Jerusalem, as a way of explaining what happened there with the exile and the return. And that understanding was that God, from God's lofty position in the heavens, sent the houses of Judah and Israel into exile for their faithless idolatry. This is a religious and cultic explanation for what happens to a society, for example, Judah and Israel, who is not paying attention to the welfare of its members. This is what happens when a society allows itself to become fragmented, to lose its identity, and becomes blind to the suffering of its land and its inhabitants. Inevitably, that society falls apart, for better or for worse. And as I have perhaps been too repetitive in past sermons about, God is particularly annoyed with the failure to take care of the marginalized, the oppressed, and the immigrants. This particular failing is the result of governmental instability, leading on a more existential level to widespread fear of collapse, death, and extinction. It's the world is coming to an end kind of thinking. When this happens, people move toward the power sources because the power sources have the motive and the means to stay alive. That mad scramble leads to a reapportionment of goods and services so that the people at the top get the stuff and the people at the bottom don't. At the point of exile, Judah and Israel had experienced several failed kings and were scrambling in this way to be close to whatever regime was in power, including Babylon, just to avoid extinction. So what is this story saying about God? This is a very vertical and discontinuous idea about how God operates with us. In this way of thinking, God is far away, acting on behalf of God's interests, meting out justice in order to carry out God's purpose. The idea here is that if we lead the life God dictates, we will avoid exile, or as I would put it, loneliness and suffering. But the story of Jesus is not that. The story of Jesus is a story of a man who has not forgotten the members of his community, who has not been blind to the suffering of the land and its inhabitants. The life of Jesus that we have been taught for 2,400 years now is one of deliberate engagements with activities and conversations which will bring about his suffering and death. In spite of all that, in spite of having lived the life prescribed by the commandments, Jesus did not and could not avoid suffering and loneliness. Unless we think that Jesus was only acting, only pretending to be human, we have Paul's testimony, which we are to understand is based on accounts of people who were there. Paul says that Jesus offered prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears. With loud cries and tears. This is not the picture of a man with flowing locks and flowing robes, ensconced in a beautiful garden in Gethsemane, gazing serenely above. This is a picture of a man who is desperate and frightened, begging for mercy. A person with the kind of suffering that we have. A person who is just as worried and anxious about loneliness, suffering, and death as we are. And Paul says, and this is what is so revealing, at least to me, he was heard. That's it, he was heard. No response, no reassurance, no promise of help. He was heard. He was heard, and then he surrendered to his fate. And what becomes clearer to me here is that Jesus believed in a God whom he called Father, a God who is not far away, but close to his heart. Not waiting for Jesus to get things right, but listening, loving, and accompanying Jesus through the inevitable. This is really a different way of seeing God. This represents a huge shift in human consciousness this new awareness of the nearness and attentiveness of God. Elia Delio is a Franciscan theologian and scientist, and she says, the God of heaven became the God of earth. We're never told what Jesus does to deal with his anxiety. We never see him obsessing about what is to come, or spending too much money, or driving too fast, or taking it out on his loved ones, or getting depressed. Did he do those things? I have no idea. But in this one passage from Paul, I see it all. I see the terror. I see the protest. I see the uncertainty about whether he can really do this. I can feel it in my bones. And this is what makes this story and what is coming next real for me. And I wonder, how did he get to the point of surrender? We have been taught to believe that his perfect obedience is what sets him apart from the rest of us, and certainly that's true. But heaven help us, that's hard to swallow. These are the words that John uses to describe Jesus' thinking. And what should I say? Father, save me from this hour? No, it is for this reason that I have come to this hour. I can only believe that Jesus went willingly to his death because he became aware that God was very attentive to his lonely suffering and lived inside him with that pain. And that despite the fact that he could not know what it would mean to be raised in 3 days, how could he know? He hadn't died yet. It was the culmination of his work of making God known in the world to do this, to die. And without that, there would have been no point to his life. There is, in this gospel, an invitation to think about us as part of the cosmos, which is the outflow of divine energy. There is an invitation here to see ourselves as part of the powerful fabric of divine energy, part of everyone and everything else, one cosmic piece. That wholeness does not end in death. Just try something with me this week. As you walk around outside, say to yourself when you see a stranger, what I think and say and do affects that person. Look at the trees and the rivers and the sky and say, I am made of the same stuff that they are, and I need them. See what happens. In these days of watching the old ways slowly and painfully wither, and the new ways quickly and painfully emerge, the church, and really I'm just talking about you and me, has plenty to say about how things could be. Plenty. We know that we belong to each other. We belong to each other in deeply physical and spiritual ways, and that each and all of us matter. We can say that aloud. We can vote for that. We can act that. And we can light the way. So let us go into Holy Week awake with courage and conviction.